Let's welcome Melissa Miller.
Well, good morning. Do you mind if I take this off? Is that okay? Yes? It's okay. I move around just a bit, so. Well, it's so nice of you to have a feast in my honor this morning. Just kidding. This is actually my first Mops experience. I've never actually spoken at a Mops before. I speak at churches and women's ministry, so this is my first time. So all other Mops will now have such a high bar because you're all so sweet and the food was delicious. Like she said, my name is Melissa Miller, and I can relate to Priscilla being just side by side with my husband in ministry, and we have three awesome children, 3, 6, and 9. So girl, boy, girl, and we had parent-teacher conferences. Does anybody else have parent-teacher conferences this week or coming up? So I had the funniest, most embarrassing parent-teacher conference yesterday, and so I thought, this is a room full of moms. They're going to appreciate this, and when they go in for their parent-teacher conference, nothing will compare. It'll just be smooth sailing compared to what happened. So my son, he is the passionate one, and he is very different. The oldest daughter, Hannah, is very like the typical oldest child, very responsible, very logical, wins awards at school all the time. And so when Bishop started school, my son, we made a conscious decision. We are not going to compare him to his sister. We are not going to expect if he doesn't, do as well in school, or if he doesn't rise to the top of the charts or win awards, like it's okay. He's different, He's just sort of the daredevil type, like wants to climb to the highest height and jump off, and just a boy. He actually has done super well in school, very particular. Everything kind of has to be just so. And but we sat down to do conferences, went through all math, reading, everything's doing good. And then she just picked out a sample of, they have to do their journal entry and do a picture. And she's like, well, let's read a sample. Will you read one of your samples? So she picked one out and put it in front of him, a sample of his, what he was supposed to write about. So the topic for that day was, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through this without getting the giggles. The topic was, if I lived long ago, if I lived, anyways, they're studying different history and stuff. So if I lived long ago. And so, so she says, will you read this out loud to us? And he said, sure. And so he starts reading it, and he says, if I lived long ago, I would have to go. And then he just stops, and he puts his head down. And I look over his shoulder, and I read the word, and it says poop. And this is one of those things. He wrote about how they didn't have bathrooms, so he would have to go poop in a hole. And the pictures were all, he was so embarrassed, because this is one of those moments where it's like, I didn't realize I was going to have to read this out loud in front of my mom and in front of my teacher. So he doesn't want to say the word. And I'm on one side and his teacher's on the other. And it's just silent. And when I get nervous, I start laughing. So I am I'm praying. I'm like, Jesus, please, because I'm giggling in the inside, and you're trying not to let it fully come out. But I'm like, he's not in trouble. I think this is hilarious, but I want him to know he's not in trouble, because his face is so red. And he looks up at me, and I'm smiling. So he sees me smiling. So he smiles, and then he gets up and he's like this. I should have used a different word. And he goes, I should have said potty. And he was just so why did I use the word poop? And so his teacher goes, well, do you want to move on to the next sentence? And he just he was so embarrassed. And so she's like, okay, we'll just move this aside. But it was so funny, because he uses boys, it is innate in them. They laugh about toots and poop, and it's hard because we don't talk like that at home. And me and my daughters, we don't laugh about it. We don't talk. It's not really that funny, but to him it was cannot believe I had to read this out loud. So it was hilarious. So thankfully he's doing good in school, and in all other areas we're fine. But it was pretty funny. I'm gonna have to keep that one and read it to him later and tell him the story. So I'm talking today about having the courage to love people extravagantly. How many of you would love to be able to give more love freely and not hold back and have the courage to love more extravagantly? I have a pretty crazy story. I have some people from Canvas Church here that are here to hear me speak. They have actually heard bits and pieces of my story, and so it's so nice to have some familiar faces, and love them so much. We just started a second location for our church about 9 weeks ago, and so these women have been so faithful to help start that church and do whatever it takes, and it's all hands on deck when it's church planning. They're nodding like, yes, it is. So basically, I did not grow up in a Christian home. And I thought my life was pretty normal, and my mom had a good job, and my dad owned gas stations. That was kind of the family business, and everything was pretty good. And maybe some of you have experienced divorce in the family, but when you're young, it kind of takes you by surprise. Usually, you don't know that there's that many issues going on until they announce. And so I was about 8 or 9 years old when they announced that they were going to be getting divorced, and they wanted to know who I wanted to live with. And I remember pulling their hands together and just saying, "I want you both. I want you both." And it was so difficult. But the hardest part was that my mom, although we had such a great relationship and such a wonderful, close relationship before that point, that heartbreak really changed my mom. And I remember we got in a small car accident that was pretty minor, but she got some whiplash. And so we went to the doctor, and the doctor prescribed her some pain meds, and she really wanted more of those pain meds. And I believe that maybe she had dabbled in some different things before that point, but there was an addiction that really took root at that point when she started doing these pain medications, and it started kind of moving its way into other areas, started moving into alcohol and heavier drugs. And so throughout, my young teenage years, it just grew more and more distant. And for those of you who have loved ones that are addicts, kind of got to the point where, have you ever felt homesick for someone? And homesick for someone, but yet they're standing right in front of you, like this is not that person anymore. And that's kind of how it started to become. I was homesick for my mom, although she was right there in the same house with me and right there in front of me at times. Just the addiction really just taking away, that vibrance of her personality that she had before that point. And so she lost her job, and we started just escaping eviction, and she ended up, getting together with a guy who would be her long-term boyfriend, and they had a baby together. So it was my half-sister, and things just got worse and worse. And I thought at one point I was about 13 or 14 years old, and I thought, well, I want to be able to relate to my mom. No matter what I need to do to get this relationship back, I'm going to do it. And so she's into drugs, I'm going to be into drugs too. So very young age, I started dabbling in these drugs too, like hardcore drugs. And it was a conversation with my grandma. And so if you are a grandma in this room, don't underestimate your voice. Because a very simple conversation, and she just said, if you want to have a different life than what you see, she said, what you need to do, and I don't know if it's like the best advice, but it was what I needed to hear at that point. And she said, you just need to get good grades in high school. That's all you need to do. And if you get good grades in high school, she's like, you can get a scholarship and you can go to college and you can have a better life. And so I just thought, you know what? I don't really know why I'm doing the drugs. I don't really want to be like my mom. I don't want to turn out like that. And so I'm going to take her advice, and I'm going to get good grades. And so once I got into be a freshman in high school, I just thought, I'm going to really start trying. And I immersed myself in extracurricular activities and getting straight A's and, just really immersed myself in school. But unfortunately, the distance with my mom and I, it grew more and more. And so we escaped another eviction and then moved to a little town called Sutherland, Oregon. And so I lived there, and she was on one side of the triplex that we lived in was a family that had prescription drugs, very accessible just due to health stuff. And so she was getting prescription drugs on that side. And then on the other side, they were heavy into meth. So it was the worst combination of these addictions that she had. And so I got to the point where I knew that my mom had never been abusive, but I thought that maybe at one point these drugs, I always feared that maybe it would cross that line or that it would go too far. And so there was one day that I came home from school, and it was my fear. There was just a combination of drugs that she had done that made her unrecognizable, and she was throwing dishes and she was hitting me and all of these things. And I had made a friend named Brittany at school, and she was just this beautiful soccer player and just so welcoming and friendly to me. And I would spend a lot of time at her house, and her family was so welcoming to me. Her mom was so welcoming to me. Her mom was from England originally, and she always wore Celtic crosses, and she always had tea, and just fed me every time I was over there, and just treated me like one of her own. And so I knew I had to go to Brittany's house at that point. And so I walked out of the door as my mom was going up the stairs, and she ended up hearing me walk out, and I was gonna head out to Brittany's house. Brittany's dad was actually a police officer, and Brittany's mom was a registered foster parent. So God had really placed me in this situation where I had this safe place to go to. So I was running to Brittany's house, even though it was quite a distance away. I tears streaming down my face. I knew it wasn't safe to be there. And so my mom gets in the car and follows me, and I can hear her behind me in the car and yelling at get in the car, and she's swerving over to where I'm at. But this is my mom. She's never hurt me before. She's never done anything, even when we were in that accident, when she got on prescription pain meds, she had the mom reflex. This is the mom who's always protected me. And so I thought, surely there's no way she will hit me with the car. And unfortunately, the drugs were just too strong in her system, and she did. And she swerved over, and she hit me with the car. So I fell into a gravel ditch, and I remember just in shock, absolute shock. Thankfully, I didn't have any broken bones, and I was okay. But I got in the car, and she was swerving everywhere, all over the road, and we stopped at the DMV, and she kind of didn't make sense at that time because she was saying that she was going to have me put into juvenile hall as a runaway, and so she thought the DMV was I think, a jail or something. And so she said, stay here. And so she got out of the car, and I was actually closer to Brittany's house at this point than I was even before. So of course I ran out of the car, and I went and hid for about 30 minutes because she knew where Brittany lives, so I didn't want to get there too soon. And I kind of found a place to rest for a while and compose myself. And once I got to Brittany's house, they said my mom had been there looking for me and throwing every closet door open, and but that she had left. And so Brittany's mom hugged me, and she could sense that there was something going on at home, but I never talked about it. And so that was the moment where I was able to just be honest with her and share with her all that I had been dealing with at home, and all that my mom had gone through, and how it had gotten worse. And so my mom ended up admitting to the police that she hit me with the car. So I had just open door on CPS's end and on the authorities' end to stay at Brittany's house. And so through these months of staying at Brittany's house, I experienced unconditional love that was beyond what I can even fathom, because I know how tight my family is and how big of a deal that would be to invite someone in that wasn't a part of my family. And yet that's the way that they treated me. And I think I had such a hard time experiencing this. They threw around the idea of legal adoption, and I just was like, there's no way that these people want me. I guarantee in 6 weeks they're going to regret their decision to take me in. There is just no way that they really, really want me to stay here. And Christmas time rolled around, and I remember I'm sitting on their couch. They had just decorated for Christmas, and I look up at the mantle, and there's all these stockings up on the mantle, including my name on one of the stockings. And I remember just bawling. And Brittany's younger sister, Rachel, she came over and she wrapped her arm around me, and she just said, your sister Sierra, we'll have her up there one day too. We'll adopt her one day too, which meant so much to me because it was so hard leaving her behind in a situation that I felt like was unsafe. And so it was so hard for me to fathom that they would want me as a part of their family, that I didn't open myself up to them. And I just thought, this is going to end, and maybe give it a month or another 2 months, and they're going to regret this decision, and they're not going to want me as a part of their family. It was so hard to both receive love and give love to this family who just offered it so freely to me. So over time, my dad found out what was kind of going on at home. I hadn't really talked to him about it much either. And once he found out, here's where I'm living, this is what happened with Mom, he finally made a phone call after we had talked, and he said, why don't you come up and live with me? I think it's time. And of course, I jumped at that chance because I was convinced I was a burden to Brittany's family. And so I jumped at that chance to go up and live with my dad, and maybe just be able to at school just say, yeah, I live with my dad, as opposed to I live with Brittany and I have to explain the story. And so, as a kid, I just wanted to be normal. I wanted just to fit in with everybody else. So I went up to Vancouver to live with my dad, and I had kept in touch with my mom here and there, but it was really difficult when she was on drugs to be able to make any contact and connection with her. Kept in touch with my sister as well. And so I started living with my dad, and it was shortly after that that my mom came to visit me. And she came to visit me, and she seemed sober, and I was happy to hear that she seemed sober and to see that she seemed sober. And I remember we went out to lunch, and then we went and we sat on my bedroom floor for a bit, and we started talking. And I remember at one point during the conversation, she said, at this point she had been evicted so many times, she was in a trailer park. And so she said, I met this woman in a trailer park, and I think that she's my friend. And I said, well, that's great. What have you done together? Or, and she said, well, she invites me over sometimes to do crafts with me. And I think I have a friend now. And I said, what do you mean? And then she got tears in her eyes, and she said, I don't really have any friends, I don't really have anyone that thinks of me as a friend. So it was a really big deal to her that somebody would invite her in and just do crafts with her. And so I reached my hand out, and that was a moment where because I had a lot of resentment, obviously, towards my mom. I knew what she could be. I knew what we used to have. I knew the potential in her. I knew the great job she used to have. And I was so angry so much of the time at her. And I think that was such a breakthrough moment because I had compassion for her, which is huge. And I reached my hand out to her, and I put my hand on her hand, and I said, you have me. You have me. I'll be your friend. And so I didn't know that was the last time I was ever going to see her. But I'm so glad that it ended that way. I'm so glad that my last interaction with her was a breakthrough moment for us and for our relationship. And then she said, I forgot, I have to give you something. And she had framed this picture, and she'd never made anything like this before. Like I said, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. And she never talked about the Bible. She never talked about Bible verses. But yet she made me this framed picture, and she did calligraphy by hand. It was beautiful. And it had the verse in 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoings, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. And on the back of this picture, it said, watch out for wolves, my little lamb. And I didn't know what that meant. She had been talking about this guy that she had been seeing for a bit, and maybe she was going to leave her boyfriend and go live with him, and he was rich. And, I didn't really make anything of it. But the next call that I got was from my Aunt Tammy saying that my mom had died and that she didn't know the details, but I needed to call my grandmother right away. And once I got the details of what happened, my mom had been dabbling in meth and got involved with a meth dealer. And this dealer happened to be one of the most wanted men in the state of Oregon at that time. So when she decided and realized how dangerous this man was, she decided that the only way out was to go to the police and tell them how far kind of in, because he started getting obsessed with her and wouldn't take no for an answer and different things. And so she went to the police and said, we need to turn this guy in. I'm willing to do what it takes to get him caught. I'm way in deep with this guy, and I need help and I need out. So Officer John Hanlon is his name, and he set up a sting operation with the police so that her and this meth dealer that she had been involved in would basically meet up at this point. That was a fake drug deal. And when they would get there, both her and Lee, the man's name was, would be arrested. And then when they got back to the prison, then they would release my mom and let her go. So she met up with Lee, this man, and they never made it to that drug point. They never made it to that meeting point where the fake drug deal was supposed to take place. And she was missing for 3 days. And so I didn't know any of this took place. I didn't know she went to police. And so when I heard my mom was missing, I thought that maybe she had ran off with that guy that she was telling me about, and she decided to leave her boyfriend, and maybe she really just wanted a different life with the hot tub and I thought maybe she's just taking a break for the weekend. I didn't think anything of it. And basically on Monday, my grandmother, her mom, got a call saying he has me at Seven Feathers Casino and he's burning me with acid and you need to call the police right away and tell them where I'm at. And the officers went to Seven Feathers and they found them in a Jeep right outside of the hotel. Lee, the meth dealer, decided he didn't want to cooperate with police, so he sped off with my mom in the car in a stolen Jeep. They were going about 80, 90 miles an hour, evading police, and he had a gun in the car, and we still to this day don't know if she jumped out or she was pushed or she fell, but she died when he was evading police, and he ran into... After he couldn't go any further, he ran into a field and they arrested him, and then he ended up committing suicide in prison a couple weeks after that. So this was a week before my 17th birthday when this happened. So you can imagine that was a lot for a teenager to comprehend and to understand and to process, especially not knowing the Lord. So the beautiful part of my story comes because after my mom's death, I prayed for the first time that I have ever prayed in my life. And I had said maybe the grace prayers at Thanksgiving when we would do Thanksgiving with extended family, but I never really had a heartfelt prayer myself. And so I sat down and I was at my dad's kitchen table, and it was a very sloppy, messy, snotty, ugly, unrefined, God, I don't know if I'm supposed to introduce myself with my first name and my last name, or if you just know who I am. I mean, I knew nothing about anything about God or the Bible. So I prayed for the first time in my life, and I just said, God, I need you to show me if you're real. I need, obviously I was just bawling, and I just said, show me that everything is going to be okay. I need to know that you're real, that you have a plan in all this. And I think the words probably weren't even as eloquent as that. It was just, my first prayer. And so maybe a 60-second prayer at the most. And in the very moment that I prayed, my dad walked in. He came in. I could hear his Yukon pulling up in the driveway, and he had a pink envelope in his hand. And he dropped the pink envelope right in front of me, and it had my name on it and his work address, and it didn't have a return address on it. And he said, I'm so sorry. I kept forgetting to give this to you. It's been in my office for months. And it was delivered, February. I'm sorry, I forgot. And I don't know who it's from. So I just finished my crazy prayer, and I open up this card, and it is from my mom, that she had sent it back in Valentine's Day, and she died at the end of March. And at the very moment that I prayed, I opened up this card, this Valentine's card, and it said, I know we don't always see things eye to eye, but we always see them heart to heart, and I'll always love you, and I'm so proud of you. And I knew at that moment God was real, and God had answered my prayer, and I didn't have anyone to tell me what that meant or who that God was, but that was the first seed that was planted in my heart, that God is so real. And so after that point, I continued on the path that my grandma had put me on, getting good grades and excelling in school, and became the first person in my family to go to college. And sorry, I didn't realize maybe it's going to be that time of the month here soon. I usually can push through a little better. I think it's a room full of women, right? We can feel our energy.
So I went to college and still kind of hurting over the death of my mom, still not understanding exactly, and kind of having that seed that was planted that God was real, but not really knowing what to do with that. So I was a sophomore in college, and I was in this philosophy class, and it was an atheist professor of all things that could have drew me to God. He wrote on the board, "If you knew there was a God, would you change your life today?" And for some reason, that question haunted me. I could not escape it because I knew that experience that I had back when I was just turned 17. And I knew that if I really, really believed that in my heart of hearts, I would want to know who God was, and I would want to know what pleased him so that I could do what pleased him. And those two thoughts and that question was just mulling around in my heart and my mind. And I was a cheerleader in college and sorority, and I had this boyfriend, and doing the typical college thing, and but I could not stop thinking about that question. And so there was this man named Brandon Miller. He played football with my boyfriend at the time, and he was the Fellowship of Christian Athletes president on campus. So everyone kind of knew he was the guy in the cafeteria, the only one who would take off his hat and he would pray before his meal. So if you had any questions about anything God related, the Brandon Miller was the guy to go to. And so I sent him an email, and I just said, "Hey, this is what happened. I can't escape this question. I just have some questions for you about your faith. Would you be willing to meet with me and just answer some questions?" And so he, of course, said yes, and we met in the cafeteria, and he shared with me his testimony of how he had given his life to Christ at the age of 16. And he said, "Why don't you come to FCA on Thursday night and come just see what it's all about?" And so, of course, I came, and he was speaking that night, and I remember I know exactly what he was wearing. I know he was talking about Peter walking on the water, and I didn't know, but I remember after the first conversation I had with him, I went up to my roommate and I said, "Whoever marries Brandon Miller will be the luckiest girl in the whole world," because I saw how he treated every person in the cafeteria, every person that he walked by that was in a wheelchair. He showed no favoritism, and he genuinely cared about people. And I thought, if he cares about everybody else that way, how much better is he going to treat his wife? And I just saw his character was so amazing. And so I told my roommate that, not knowing that I would be that person eventually. It was funny because the boyfriend that I had was actually fairly jealous at the time, and he didn't want me going out with any other guys or spending time with them. And so I said, "Well, would you mind if I just went to lunch with Brandon Miller and asked him some questions about his faith?" So they played football together, so they knew each other. And he goes, "Oh, Brandon Miller," he goes, "he's the safest guy around. Go ahead." And so he delivered me over to my future husband unknowingly. And so I met Brandon and went to FCA, and I remember giving my life to Christ. I raised my hand, and I thought, this is it. This is what this question was all about. This is what it was for. This is what I need to do. I need to give my life to Christ. So I thought that if you sinned, even in your thought life, that you had to give your life to Christ again. So every time I went to church and every time I went to FCA, I was raising my hand and going forward. And so I just got saved over and over and over again until finally somebody said that wasn't really necessary. And so I had a lot to learn, and he invited me to be a part of this Bible study that they had, and they told us to read John. They told us to read the first chapter of John, and I didn't know that there was a John and a First John at that time. Okay, the only Bible I had was a Precious Moments Bible, with the cartoon characters on it, the little chubby babies and stuff. So I was super embarrassed about that. I didn't know, if even was the right Bible. I remember going into the Bible bookstore and asking for the Holy One. I wanted to know, just give me the Holy Bible. I don't know, whatever that one is. And so he said that I was to read John. So I read First John. It was the first John that I saw in the Bible. And I think it's about hypocrisy or something. And so everyone else went around and shared what they got out of John. And they're talking about John the Baptist and all these things. And I thought, well, I can't lie. This is my first church group that I've ever been a part of. So I'll just have to share what I got out of it. And mine was so, so far, removed from everybody else's that I obviously had a lot to learn. And Brandon's face was like, okay. And so I had a lot to learn about the word. But anyway, I ended up breaking up with my boyfriend. I actually quit cheerleading and sorority, not because those things were bad, but because I wanted to devote myself to Christ wholly, and I knew that the people that I was hanging out with and the things that I was doing, I would keep going back to them, and I would keep doing them if I stayed in that place. And so I kind of quit all that, and I told Brandon I felt like I was going through an identity crisis, and he talked to me about what it meant to truly be born again. And we remained friends for quite some time, and then, of course, ended up falling in love and getting married after college. And we moved to Vegas right after our honeymoon, which to help start a church there. I know, like the last place you would want to start your marriage in Vegas. But Christmas was the hardest time for me after my mom died. I don't know about you, if any of you have lost loved ones, but it really hits home on the holidays, doesn't it? I didn't really think about her on the day that she died. Didn't really think about her on her birthday when that came around. I mean, I would think about her, but it wasn't a solemn type of feeling. But Christmas, because she was so fanatical, even in her addiction, inside and outside decorations around the house, and she would do these, Christmas crafts and music. I mean, everything. She went all out. And so when Christmas time came around after her death, I felt a little bit bitter, and I felt like it just wasn't a time of celebration for me for many years. And everyone would try to invite me over to their house for Christmas and try to include me, even though my family was a bit broken apart. Never felt the same. And I just would go in the bathroom and I would cry, and just really felt sad during that time. And so after my husband and I got married, we found out we were pregnant, and she wasn't due until the January of the next year, January 11th. And I ended up going into preterm labor, and she was born over 6 weeks early, so December 4th. They told us that she had a blood infection, and I didn't know how serious that was. I just knew with all the hormones and everything going on, to leave my baby in the hospital and not be able to take her home was really difficult. And so we prayed and prayed and prayed, and sure enough, it was a dirty Petri dish. The healthcare in Vegas there you go. And so I was happy to be taking my baby home, but also a little bit like 3 days of just, worrying about my baby girl. But I remember I took Hannah home from the hospital, and her little stocking cap said special delivery on it in red letters. And I held her in my living room. And at that point, we had already decorated for Christmas. So we had the Christmas tree up. We had stockings all along the banister, Christmas music playing. And I remember holding my daughter. And for the first time since my mom had died, I didn't feel sad. I felt like that memory of her death was replaced with this memory of life. I felt like this moment was a moment for me, such a redemptive moment, because although I didn't have so many of the memories that I wanted to have with my mom, I knew now I was able to create that with my daughter and with my future children. And what I wasn't given, I was going to be able to give out to my children. And it was such a powerful moment of probably the most peaceful time of our lives, becoming a mother for the first time. And I remember, and I don't know if any of you have experienced this, just the fear of, am I going to be a good mom? Am I going to know what to do? Maybe you haven't been raised in the greatest home, and am I going to be able to know how to discipline them, or how to handle, all these different things that are involved with raising kids. And at that moment, it's like the mommy switch was flipped in me. Like I knew, like it didn't matter what it took. I would lay down my life for my child, and I knew I was going to be a good mom, because that was God's purpose for my life, was to create a new legacy and a new lineage of children that would know the Lord, that wouldn't have to grow up in dysfunction or drugs or conflict. And my husband has just been such a great encouragement to me. And 20 years later, the Osbornes, Brittany's family, they still hang a stocking up for me at Christmas time. So if it says the Millers now, and she's actually, I call her mom. It was a point in college when they said, listen, you're a part of our family. We call you sister. We call you daughter. We have pictures of you everywhere, and you don't call her mom. You don't call us sister. And I was like, you're right. I have held back, and I keep expecting you guys to walk out of my life and regret, and it's wrong, and you're not going anywhere, and I need to be able to give you love the same way that you've given me. And so I remember that phone call. It was Jenna, is her name, and I remember calling her and saying, hi, Mom. And I thought it was going to be really awkward, but it wasn't as awkward as I thought, and she never mentioned it. It was like I was calling her Mom the whole time. And in England, they don't call you Grandma, they call you Nanny, so she's become Nanny to my kids, and we just had her out here a couple weeks ago. She's actually visited us more times since we moved to San Diego than any of our other family, and it's just just such a beautiful picture to me of unconditional love. They absolutely wrap their arms around me and still continue to this day, even though I was so afraid that they were going to walk away or regret their decision. It's never been the case. And so I obviously have gone through, both with my husband, with the Osborns, just this fear of, can I really love? Can I really give? Can I really put myself out there and open myself up to possibly getting hurt, even if it means, I might get rejected, I might get hurt? Am I willing to love extravagantly and to give love, despite my instinct to self-preserve? And so, number one, having the courage to love people extravagantly first starts with an understanding of God's unconditional love for us. Romans 8:38 and 39 says, "For I am sure that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present nor things to come, nor powers, nor height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord." And I think that sometimes, even with God, we hesitate. And we kind of approach him much like I approached the Osborne family when I was so afraid to look up to their mantle. I was so afraid. Oh, I bet they took that stocking down this year. I don't want to look up at the mantle because I'm afraid. What if they took that stocking down? And I would look up, and every year it would be there. And every year I just felt overwhelmed with that unconditional love. But for so many years, I was afraid to look up. What if I made a mistake? What if they realized some of my faults and my failures, and they really just decided they regretted it and they were going to take that stocking down? And I think sometimes we're like that with God. What if what about the mistakes that I made? What about my past? What about this? And what about that? And we come to God like this, just so afraid that maybe he's taken that stocking down, so afraid that maybe he's retracted his love for us. And that is never the case, that there's nothing you can do, there's nothing that you've ever done that could possibly remove the love of God from your life, that he loves you that much unconditionally. Unconditionally. It doesn't mean that there's sometimes consequences to the things we do, but his love never fails. His love can never be taken away. And his love for you, that stocking, just like that stocking, it's never going to be taken down. And so for me, I think really understanding God's unconditional love for me was able to help me be able to give that out to other people, to be able to look at my mom, as I'm writing out my story and writing out my journey of what I've been through, and to be able to almost take things out as through the editing process of writing my story out, almost take things out in the spirit of forgiveness. Like, I just doesn't need to be included. God loves me unconditionally. I know God loves my mom unconditionally. And so I think understanding, having this attitude of gratefulness, like, God, I don't deserve this. I wasn't on the biological family list. I was the one who didn't deserve this. I wasn't born into this family, but yet still you love me. Still you accept me. Still you wrap your arms around me. And it's so powerful when we receive that love, because we realize that although we're not worthy of receiving it, we're also not worthless. Although we're not worthy, we're not worthless. We are so valuable in God's eyes. And no matter how many mistakes we've made or how much we've messed up, or we, don't bite our tongue the way we are so trying to, that God's love never fails. Amen. Having the courage to love people extravagantly is directly correlated with our willingness to be vulnerable. C.S. Lewis says this quote in his book, The Four Loves, that I think is so powerful. It says, "To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in a casket or a coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, unpenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable." Isn't that a powerful quote? So powerful, because at the root of all of our inability to love others is just this fear of getting hurt and this fear of rejection, isn't it? That if I really love and if I really give my heart over, what if I get hurt? What if they don't accept me? And one day I was sitting there and I was pondering that thought and pondering this quote and thinking, I'm so glad that Christ didn't look at me that way, that Christ didn't look at us that way, that when he chose to go on the cross, he wasn't thinking, well, can I really trust these people? Are they going to hurt me? Are they going to reject me? Yes and yes. Are they going to scorn me? Are they going to receive my love? I mean, all of those things. I'm so glad he gave it all, and he gave 100%, regardless of if we were going to turn our backs on him or not. He laid it all on the line when he died for us. Isn't that powerful to think about? And whenever I feel like, I think love and trust are two different things. That's different. It might take some time to build trust with people, and that's okay. But are we willing to be vulnerable and to love them anyways, even if it means we might get hurt in the process? So I think that that's a powerful part of being able to love people extravagantly. And it's something I had to walk through with the Osborne family, Brittany's family, learning that, they might just decide that maybe they regretted it. Maybe they didn't want me a part of their family, but so far they've had a pretty good track record, and I think that I can trust, and I'm going to love anyway, and I'm going to open myself up anyway. Um, Having the courage to love people extravagantly involves sowing into others what you reap yourself. I love this translation. It says, here is a simple rule of thumb, guide for behavior. Ask yourself what you want people to do for you, then grab the initiative and do it for them. Such a powerful version of that scripture, because I think sometimes we forget that that's what God calls us to do, to say, hey, how would I want to be treated? How would I want people to love me and to extend their arms to me? And I think about that woman in the trailer park that extended her arms to my mom. She had no idea how much that meant to her. She had not one single friend, not one single person to be able to embrace her and open up her arms to her. And I think about how much we hold back from being able to love others the way that we would want to be loved ourselves. I don't know how I am on time, but I think I'm 5 minutes, okay. But I think that God is so faithful, and I think that it's still difficult, I think, sometimes to know who we can trust or who we can be vulnerable with and who we can love extravagantly. And I think God puts people into our lives that prove to us that he is faithful, and he's watching over, and he's sovereign over those friendships and relationships. And I'm just so grateful to God for the opportunity to use kind of my mess of my story as an opportunity to encourage other women, specifically moms. This is just such a blessing for me to be here. I could write about motherhood, talk about motherhood all day long, because it's such a beautiful gift in my life, and I don't take it for granted, just the blessing that it is, and the honor, I think, sometimes that it is to be a mom. Sometimes I look at my children, I'm like, God, thank you so much for the honor. I get to be their mom. You picked me. And I think as we give to our children even and love them extravagantly, keeping that in mind, that it is just an honor, even though sometimes it doesn't feel like an honor. Sometimes it feels like this is a burden, or they're acting out, or they're this and they're that, just to know that is such an honor to be picked, to be chosen, that sometimes we can compare ourselves to other moms and the way they love their children, the way they give. But just know God picked you, because God wanted you to be their mom and to love them courageously and extravagantly as he loves us. Amen.